Hello?
If I could please ask all participants to turn their microphones on to mute for now, if you please. We are going to get started shortly. I'm just waiting for a few more people to join us. Okay, great stuff. I think we will get started, and then some other people can come in and join us at will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Booth, and I'm the Chief Executive of Pro Manchester. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this Knowledge Exchange webinar, which is sponsored by Virgin Money. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Gavin Opperman, the Group Business Banking Director at Virgin Money, and I'll introduce Gavin just shortly. Pro Manchester has been working with Virgin Money for over 18 months now, with their store on Market Street, and it's become the home of our SME Club events activity. Our SME Club is designed to help support the SME community in Manchester, offering support and advice to help development and growth of business. Sadly, over the past few months, we've had to close our doors and move all of our activity online. Perhaps a bit later, though, we can talk to Gavin about the reopening of the store and when we can all get back together once again. To help everything run smoothly today, can I please ask you to all turn off your cameras and your microphones to avoid any interference or distractions. But I am really keen for you all to participate today. So if you will please utilise the chat function at the bottom of your screens, and please post your questions. I'd like to encourage you to get as involved as possible during this discussion. So a little introduction to the main man himself. Gavin has over 30 years of leadership experience in risk, operations and across frontline digital, retail, commercial, corporate and investment banking services. Gavin was previously Regional Head of Consumer Banking, Standard Charter based in China, and prior to that he held a number of senior positions across Asia in a career spanning 20 years at the Barclays Group. Gavin leads the banking business franchise. He spent in excess of 30 years following his passion in banking across the globe and in various leadership roles. So we're in good hands today to talk about the current crisis, navigating our way through it, and to get some good insight from Gavin about how we progress and how we move forward. So, to start us off, Gavin, if you will, could you please maybe just give us some of your thoughts and reflections over the past few months, perhaps from a banking perspective, but also from your clients and business perspective?
Well, Sam, firstly, a very good afternoon, and thank you to yourself, but also to Pro Manchester, and thank you for setting up this afternoon. And to all those that have dialed in and part of it, really, I hope that we can share with each other this afternoon and come up with some sort of solutions. I think it goes without saying, the North and Manchester is just critical, and it's very critical to our success in the UK. To answer your question and to come back to the past few months, I really, when I chose this afternoon, I chose the globe in the back because I think there's a new norm that's dawned upon all of us, and there's a new norm that we've got to face into, and it's really going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. I think going into the pandemic was difficult, not just from a health perspective, families, new ways of work, learning how to be able to cope, and something which I think none of us are used to. I certainly lived through SARS in 2003 in Hong Kong, and at that time it was even different. So I'd moved out of China and I was in Hong Kong for a short period of time, and then later went back to China, and it was different. And this is different from the GFC. So there is something that we are facing and we've had to face into in the past 3 months, which none of us expected when we rolled out of bed on the 1st of January. However, going forward, it's critical how we're going to manage it. We've definitely experienced that businesses through these past 3 months have responded in very different shapes and forms, and it's been very sectorial driven. And it's also been driven by, in fact, saying, how can we actually cope going out? The exit has been in the background. And I hate to use the word exit because there's the B word with Brexit that was always very topical at the point. And that was in the back of the minds. And it's surely being tabled in the last few weeks. And certainly something we cannot negate. And it also adds additional complexity. But today is about coronavirus and COVID-19. and how so it's been tough for the bank like any other business, and hopefully we've risen to the occasion as best as possible using different, which we'll talk about this afternoon, hopefully different schemes and mechanisms and what we can use going forward.
Fantastic, thank you, Gavin. So in response to that, then, so perhaps we could maybe talk through some of the support schemes and the offer that Virgin Money has been providing for its businesses and its customers in the past couple of months to try and help them support them through this.
So as soon as we entered into this, Treasury responded quite quickly, and have to give credit to government in terms of that, and saying, how could government be able to support that? Virgin Money, along with the other 5 big banks, the 6 top banks, got very involved in the design of programs to be able to support that of businesses. And we're relatively familiar with that. But if I can park that for a minute, from a business perspective, we realized that firstly we have to manage our own existing customer base and see how we can support our existing customers. It was certainly a place where we realized that bringing in new business and growth and so forth, and our objectives for the year had to be reset. So we reset our business model immediately. And why that was important is we had to position our colleagues to be able to manage and operate digitally, work from home, and support the existing customer base that we've got. We also had a look and say how we can actually give extensions to current lines of credit that had been in place. We had a look at the deposit base in terms of the liquidity of businesses and see how we can support businesses' liquidity in terms of their funding, the obviously people, suppliers, and so forth that were impacted. A lot of this is cross-border as well. So we would find that a lot of this just not only from an internal UK perspective, but there's a lot of reliance, and different countries were at a different level in terms of how coronavirus was impacting that. We then gave sort of basically holidays, as we call capital repayment holidays, in terms of extensions of payments. We reduced that on certain looking at interest and how we would adopt that. Fees we discounted fees in terms of the fees to really put money back into the hands of the customer. So we tried from that perspective. We tried to build our relationships a lot closer and really made sure that our relationship managers, which we're fortunate enough going into coronavirus, going into the pandemic, we have a very strong relationship banking model. And I think that was an advantageous that we had. We had to use our digital platforms. And then to the point of that, in terms of the government schemes, the government launched first the CBIL scheme, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. That was the first scheme. On the back of that, the Bounce Back Scheme, and then the Large Business Loan Interruption Scheme. All of these schemes have been quite well utilized by many of the customer base. And what is quite nice about it, it does give you a capital and an interest break for the first 12 months. And that really can alleviate and give business the opportunity to rethink how they will approach going at the exit. The unknown of really when the start line is still pretty much unknown. Different businesses will go back. We see, for example, in the survey that we've got that 24% of businesses think that they would restart within the next 4 weeks. But that still leaves 3/4 of the businesses out there that need to restart. And what the volume of that will be, and that top line movement in terms of generation of revenue is a key component. So putting out the loan, the one thing I would encourage many people who I talk to is it's still leveraged debt. It's still debt that needs to be repaid. So it's fine to stall a business or put a foot on the ball and wait for during that interruption period. But there's still that intrinsic debt that needs to be repaid. And there's also the restart that is a lot slower, and how you sequence your business in that. And it's however small or big it might be, we're all impacted in this. So that's the key in trying to reverse that. So many of the schemes are put in place. I think they're quite helpful. I'd like to hear challenges about where they weren't helpful. They always outline who don't qualify in terms of eligibility. But is there a way we can work around that? Certainly our customer base, and I'm not here to position Virgin Money, But certainly from Virgin Money perspective, if we can help customers in some way, we want to know about it at the customer level. But I think at an industry level, that is where we see our responsibility. This is everybody's responsibility to return to that.
I mean, we wanted to definitely sort of talk about that leverage debt, and you and I were just talking prior to this about a report that came out of the weekend, an interim report from the City UK, suggesting that there's sort of 36 billion potential sort of unrepayable debt by the end of March next year because of this particular crisis, and certainly from the government loans. What advice would you give to businesses maybe really to try and mitigate against that issue and that repayment? What's the advice coming from the bank at the moment to your customers?
That leverage debt that's gone up, the number of 35 or 36 billion, is representing a probably in excess of 10% of the current back debt that's out there at the moment. So it's a significant number. Now, just standing back and looking at that and imagining economy with bank debt that's in excess of 35 billion pounds, that's a significant debt that needs to be repaid. Revenues certainly are going to battle to be able to generate that. If one looks at the forecasted GDP numbers, we saw the numbers that came out this morning, which were far-reaching, and that is very important in looking at those numbers, because it might be seen as very much in the past, but it does help us to give us a trajectory of going forward, of how this could possibly be a slow start there going forward. It's certainly not a V. I think that has been dismissed, not suggesting that it's an L return, but that rate of that return back. And please, may we not have a rebound of the virus that could impact us further. But on that assumption, to answer your question, the advice that I would give is, I think it's about looking at a business on a micro level, and for business owners to look at their specific business. The generic schemes and structures that we as banks can provide, and that we do get support from the government in terms of guarantees. But looking at your existing debt and your own business and revising the business model. Unfortunately, during times like this, one has to look at one's business model and say, is it still true what going into the pandemic, if that business model is still the right model going forward, and it needs to be trim or right sized. Now, it sounds awfully negative because there's certainly industries that will benefit from going into, for example, manufacturing or the computer or technology areas. We could see a lot of benefits, but other areas which would have to look at it more closely, for example, the hotel industry or retail and transport or business services and so forth. And these are the areas that will certainly be impacted. And the hotel trade, for example, or the restaurant business will have to look very differently at their model. And when you look at the model, then you look at your cash flow. Yeah. And the cash flow will have to overlay back onto the debt. Banks will have to be very open to have discussions with customers and saying how we can work through the scenario with our customers. No customer wants to sit with leverage debt. No, it's as simple as that. No customer wants. We want to generate capital. We want to generate profits. We want to see our businesses that bank with us do well. It's like any healthy growth that you want within your business customers. So that would be just encouraging, saying the uniqueness of each business will need to have a close look in its specific geography. That's why our sectorial approach is very important. So when we look at sectors and those sectors that get influenced more, but it's still very generic because one has to look at it from a geographical perspective. And we will talk a little bit about the North and sort of few statistics that I've got in the North that really touch on to that could be helpful.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, I know that just from a Pro Manchester perspective, I mean, we have never been so concentrated on our cash flow and scenario planning and remodeling to make sure, but always in the back of our minds, you know, we also did apply for a loan, and it's always in the back of our mind that fundamentally, you know, that has to be paid back, as does the deferring of the tax payments and everything else as well. So, you know, constantly on a weekly basis, we're always looking at those figures very, very carefully. Danny Franks has popped a little, an interesting, quite controversial question here on the chat. Do you think that many businesses will take money and run?
Well, it's a very good question. I think there's three buckets that one can put this in. We'll have the businesses that we'll work with, and we'll work through the pandemic and get a good exit and work with them. Then we'll sadly get on the other side of the scale businesses that, if we're real about it, are just not going to get through it. And they're going to have to, people will have to, as individuals, reset their business. And these are not because the businesses just were bad businesses. It's just circumstantial, and they'll not survive. And then I think to the question, there might be some people, and hopefully that is really the minority, that would use the scheme and cash in on it, and use those funds. But that would be really irresponsible. We certainly went through a very robust eligibility criteria. We really looked at it very closely, and we still do that every day. And if there are businesses and individuals and companies that will bank with us, that do require support, we certainly will. I hope that level of, I could almost, language is just fraud, doesn't happen, because it's not good for the rest of the UK. And it just sets someone else back. But unfortunately, to the second point, there are some businesses that are just, because they're not willing to repay, they're just not able to repay. And we're going to have to help them. These are especially our young entrepreneurs, people starting out on businesses, new businesses. That worries me immensely. All the startups, all that initiative. The UK is so rich with IP, and the startups and what it was like on the back end of last year worries me. These startups are going to be impacted, not because they were bad ideas, but because money and expertise are going to have to be focused elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that the government will have to offer even more support going forward? Obviously, we've got the end of the furlough scheme coming up at the end of October. We've obviously already had the variety of different sort of loans and schemes coming out. Do you think that there's going to have to be more of that?
So I think a very good question, and certainly a question which my colleagues have been asking me all the time. And I've said, I think it will shift from debt and borrowing to the banks. And we can start to see them starting to trend off in terms of the support into the business world and into the furlough scheme. So with the commitments that they've given the extension till the end of October. So we will see that the self-employed will be supported, but it has to come to an end at some point. And I think it's going to be very dependent on how long the pandemic and how quickly businesses will start to return. The government putting more money behind it, or putting more guarantees or financial support, whether it's direct or indirect, is going to be very hard for government to do that. I think it's now for us as banks, and I think it's for us as business equally, to try and work a way through this. That said, the unemployment number is the number that worries me. I'm not mirroring that at all on the US. The US is a different economy. It's a different approach that's been adopted. And I'm certainly not a scholar on the US. But what I can say is that we in the UK are going to be faced with a high level of unemployment, and we need to get people back into circulation. That is very little that the government can do that, other than obviously creating opportunities or helping us to create opportunities, and maybe getting the economy opened up in certain areas where it is safe to do so as soon as possible. So I don't see too many avenues. There might be some small extensions, but other than that, I can't see much more that they can do.
I think you know, we are obviously starting to see that the release of the lockdown restrictions now coming out of government. Yet the messages have been a little bit confused. What's your opinion generally on the government response? I think from an initial perspective, it was extremely well received with regards to the amount of support that was out there and put on offer. But it seems to perhaps have gone a little downhill from that point onwards into the returning to work sort of scenario. Just wondering what your sort of opinion on that was.
I would obviously want businesses back. There's just no doubt about it. I would drive incredibly hard and I'll try and influence, but there would be an overriding factor, and that would be to be responsible. Their health has to trump returning back to business. So I think possibly the sectors and the way we approach it and where we can start sooner is quite important. There are difficult decisions. The education was an interesting one in this past week, where we thought we'd start to see people go back to school a lot earlier and then withdraw. That's an interesting. I'm not too sure if that is always that helpful. We should be consistent in our decisioning and we should stick with it. Germany is a very good case in point where they've been rather bold in the return back to work. I think the learning out of Europe in terms of boldness could also help a little bit. There's always a price to pay. I would never want to suggest that we should put lives on the line for that, but I do suggest that there is a calculated risk that can take place, and there is a lot of learnings out of other economies that we could import into the UK and start to open the economy a lot sooner and start getting growth. I'm very keen to see businesses go back, even if it is at small measures, even if we can get a 5 or a 10% turnover. It's about building the relationship, sending the message out, the doors are open, we're going to come back to business. We're looking at new avenues for distribution. We're looking at manufacturing. We're seeing how we can get the construction going, plants going. These are the kinds of things that really build an economy. It builds confidence, consumer confidence. It gives us as individuals hope. We know that being locked up, we're not wired that way. We weren't grown to be sitting in our offices. We like to be out there. We touch and feel it, whilst we can't get that close. So I'd like to see a little bit more of that growth going forward. But I do go with government in saying, yes, we must be responsible, but let's not be overcautious on it.
You mentioned just prior to this call when we were chatting, obviously you spent an incredible amount of time in China and in Asia, and China are obviously building back now and starting their recovery, and there's perhaps some learnings that we could take from some of that. So perhaps maybe you'd like to share some of that with us.
Yeah, I've still got some very close ties back to China, having spent 2 decades there and living in Shanghai most of that time. And I think the learning out of this, I've got a lot of good relationships back in China. I think we must first be cautious about statistical data that we get out of China. I'm not suggesting that their data is wrong, but we should just make it relevant to the data that we use in the UK and say the direct comparison is not always such a good idea. But that said, the way they've gone about it in terms of barcodes and the way they've returned back into society and they've started to open up, that has been very encouraging. They've looked at it on a regional basis. They've taken a level of risk in certain areas and certain geographies. They've definitely felt they've got to restart the economy, been rather aggressive in certain areas. What the impact on health is directly, it's really hard to be able to say on a macro China level, but certainly in a state area, and if we took Shanghai that has half of the UK population, for example, it certainly has started up, and it's definitely, and we haven't seen the rebound of the pandemic into Shanghai. Wuhan has sort of a bit of a blip in it, but it's one economy that they've just controlled quite closely. And I think what they've done is they've looked and seen where those economies, where the data showed them or indicated to them that they can take that risk. So I think back to the earlier point on the UK thoughts, China has been very aggressive in certain sectors and certain areas. It's a global factory, and they've got to get their factories up and they have got it on limited in terms of the levels of production that's going on, but it is also determined about what the rest of the globe is actually demanding. So we take something like PPE, we see the PPE that's coming through from China. That is because their factories are up and running. And I think we're getting a bigger population that are participating in the manufacturing and in the development. Certainly in the coal and the heavy metal areas, those are back in production. And China wants to make sure that they will be well positioned as the rest of the globe starts to open up. And I think we could possibly take some of that learning for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. We've had a couple of questions on the chat. So one from Paul Mirage. Will the banks go for directors if the business folds? And also another one following from Darren Smith. Given the level of debt drawn in a short space of time, will UK banks have appetite and balance sheet strength to continue funding at pre-COVID-19 levels?
Sorry, would the bank go for directors if the business folds?
The business folds.
If the business folds. So many of our lending, a lot of our lending that we do, I'm not a big one in favor of taking personal guarantees. We take, in fact, very limited. And the reason for that is we take risk on the business. We don't take risk on individuals. We back the people who run the businesses, and we take the risk on the business. That is absolutely critical for a basic, if you're looking at commercial and corporate banking, that's the way one should do it. If we look at the government schemes that have been put in place, the schemes, one of the provisos or one of the things we've worked incredibly hard with government on is to make sure that we did not get personal guarantees on any of the schemes at all. It also stipulates very clearly in those schemes that we cannot retake away homes or motor vehicles and so forth in the event that the business folds. These are very wise decisions in terms, please, if I might say, because I was obviously part of the design of that scheme, and I don't say the scheme is foolproof, but it was very important that those schemes, because everybody who's returning back to business is wanting to make a success. They've probably got, in 99% of the case, more to lose than what the government has got or the bank has got in terms of funding. These are long-lasting businesses that have been going for many, many years. So the entrepreneurs, the business owners, the well-established business, each and every one of them have put a lot more in than what the bank and what the government is putting in behind it. So to answer the question in a long way, is certainly that's not our intention at all. Where there is a private individual or whatever and has a mechanism to be able to liquidate the debt, we'd look to them to ask to say, can you help to be able to support the debt? But we'll have to look at and see it on an individual cases once again. Sam, sorry, I just missed your second question. Apology, I should have written it down.
No, not at all. We can go back. So from Darren Smith, given the level of debt drawn in a short space of time, will the UK banks have appetite and balance sheet strength to continue funding at pre-COVID-19 level?
Darren, that's a fantastic question. So without getting too technical about banks, for all of us, what post the 2008, the GFC crisis, the regulatory requirement was that we would retain as banks what we call a cyclical buffer. That is a buffer in capital that we would hold and retain as banks to make sure that going into another crisis, the bank had sufficient capital and the bank was well liquidated, had enough capital to be able to liquidate any debt. That cyclical buffer, the PRAs agreed to release that. That meaning that a bank's capital holding, the amount of capital the bank is required to hold, has reduced going into the crisis. That is incredibly helpful, not only as the bank is in the crisis now, but going forward as we go out of the crisis, there will be additional funding that requires, and we'd be able to support that. That said, from a Virgin Money perspective, and from I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of the other banks, but reading their web pages, I'm getting similar kind of feedback. And I think it's something that's public to all of us, is that banks are looking at their own customer base and saying how we can fund and support them before looking at growth of new customer base. But that doesn't mean that we will not see growth across the asset base, across the actual existing. The second part is the portion which we often refer to as the liquidity, and that's the liability management, which sits within the bank side. The banks generally across the board, as we've seen them now, are very liquid at the moment, and the banks have enough liquidity to be able to support that. And I do believe that will hold out quite well for some time. But I think when the winter comes, the winter could be cold because people will need, and I'm talking January through to March, and sort of my thinking is saying we haven't seen the true impact of that in the commercial sector. I think January through to March, we'll start to see some of the funds that is held on deposits and people will start utilizing to re-kickstart the business, whether it's purchase of stock, starting to get plants running, and so forth. That's where we'll see some of it. But to your question, which is a very, very good question, the banks are well capitalized. The regulator is incredibly close to it. And I think we've always been seeing negative interest rates as something that's been spoken of. Not too sure if that is the solution. I think the banks will rather be given more stimulus from the Bank of England to be able to support us to be able to go forward. That we could quite well see.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks, Gavin. So I know that you're quite an optimistic person. You and I chatted before about having this positive mental attitude. And in your bio it says, strive to be the best version of myself and having fun on my journey. So with all of the challenges, and we've talked about some of them considerably already today, where do you see the opportunities for growth out of this crisis? And how do you see that the businesses can really take advantage of those opportunities?
Yeah. So right up front, I would not exclude any sectors. And I think that is very important. There's no sector that I would say is excluded. If somebody's in a particular sector, it doesn't mean that sector won't stand good going out. The question will be is to what level that specific sector would need to reshape itself going into the new norm or the new world that we're going to be operating within. And I think it's really important that some of these will be challenged more than what others. I mentioned to that of technology. I mean, technology is going to have immense opportunities. But within that, technology that we utilized and we used possibly going into this crisis, it will be a little bit different. There'll be more requirements from companies to be able to deliver, but what that requirement is key. We'll also want our customers to be able to transact, not only from a banking perspective, from all levels of business, whether it be education. We see things like Cambridge University and their support on technology. The areas that I think that could be heavily challenged as we're really going forward, and I don't know the way through this, is really looking at the whole travel world and the entertainment, the food and drink. And I do believe that those sectors will still hold out well is in some shape is because we as human beings are still inquisitive and we're still social. And given that social interaction, that engagement will need to. But I think that within that, the opportunity and the creativity would have to come within it. Transport, for example, is another area. How are we going to deal with transport? And that is not only the rail services, those are individual transports. We obviously see the whole carbon area that's coming out and that's speaking. So transport will be key. We very exposed, or we not exposed, we committed to the healthcare. And I think from a healthcare perspective, that's going to be a reshape. We've seen the challenges within care homes, so they will have to remodel themselves as well. So I haven't given it a direct answer, and I do apologize. And it'd be interesting to know what sector we're specifically talking about, and I could give some sort of insights. But on that, or my view on it, but the sectorials will all be impacted, but they'll be impacted a little bit differently depending on the challenges that they face into.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. I think I'm going to want to sort of try and bring this round to Manchester really at some point, and that probably segues me quite nicely to do that actually. So one of the big themes that's been coming out of this, looking at the recovery plan, certainly from a sort of a northern agenda, is certainly Liverpool and Manchester specifically, from our metro mayors, has been this Build Back Better campaign. So not returning to business as usual, back to that old normal, to looking at the new normal and actually grasping hold of some of those opportunities but this is presented to us. Sort of there has always been on the agenda for the carbon neutral in Manchester by 2038, which was an ambitious target. But perhaps, the reduction in commuting by personal car, etc., has helped to sort of maybe accelerate some of those particular issues. And I know some of those agendas. So I know that the green agenda specifically has sort of accelerated and skyrocketed within Manchester, as has the digitalisation and a lot of the stuff that sits around the sort of local industrial strategy. So it was really that point about actually this has been a tough and challenging time for all of us, but actually we can now look at our business models, the way that we're working. We've now adapted to this new normal, working from home and remotely, and how do we grasp onto some of those opportunities to move forward and keep hold of them rather than losing them all once we do start to open back up and return back into the offices and into the city. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where, I mean, lots of businesses have had to pivot. So I'm just wondering whether there is any specific businesses that you know of that you've maybe been working with that have radically adapted their operations during this crisis, and actually coming out with quite a different business on the other side of it.
Yeah. So if I could just sort of steal a microphone and just facing to the north a little bit and just give a few sort of thoughts and what worries me, and I think people might resonate with some of us. If we said that in March, about a third of the companies and the businesses in the north were being impacted. Now 92% are. Now that is the huge shift that has taken place in 2 months. So we're already seeing that huge shift, and we're seeing at the moment 40% of the people that we've surveyed are saying they have cash flow problems. And in our total level, 28% are saying they have less than 3 months of cash flow reserves. So this is what, and it's just because there has been this huge decline in sales. And we also know that the furlough scheme will only help so far. Remembering that half of businesses have actually made use of the furlough scheme. And more than half of the companies that have furloughed more than half of their total employees. So it's a large number. That labor force has all got to come back. They've all got to come back. And I think the best way to do it is, we as a bank never used the furlough scheme, or we couldn't. We were short of resources and time and so forth. So we were really stretched, but we had to change our models. And a lot of our staff, many of our staff will never return to their existing places of work. We will work remotely. And we have been working remotely over the last 3 months. Nobody's returned back to the offices. I would say, I don't have the exact percentage, but I would say far less than 10% of our staff are still in the offices. And those that are in offices obviously need the social distancing that's applied in terms of the requirements. So we are going to have to look at many of the business models. The business models which we look at, restaurants, for example, are now allowed to sell takeaways. Suddenly the regulation have changed. We started to look at this, and therefore it's already been forced in that direction. We could see, for example, hotels, how the health is going to be impacted in hotels, how people are going to do check-ins. We're starting to look at the hotels. People will check in digitally. They will get their keys via digital on their iPhones. People have started to make these adaptations. So many of these adaptations might actually appear to be quite small, but they're actually material. There will need to be certain health checks for people that are making use of hotels. And I'm just taking the hotel sector as one sector. We look at restaurants, and we can see, Sam, you referred China, and the distancing in certain of the restaurants. And we're starting to see many of the countries in Europe applying that same principle. So we're starting to see businesses already starting to adjust themselves. I was walking through the Canary Wharf very early this morning, and I was walking through there, and it was quite interesting, a shop starting to work towards opening up in next week. And as they open up, you can already see how they've rearranged their shops and how they've arranged to be able to cater. We're going to have to do this. And this is so every single bit. And I'm sure, if this is 101 that I'm talking to very mature business owners, please forgive me. But that's where every single business will have to be adjusted. And remembering that the smaller businesses are probably those that have been impacted the most and will find it very difficult to be able to return. Sam, I think you're on mute at the moment.
There's some gardening going on in the background, so I didn't want to disrupt you. Talking about sort of the north, then I think one thing that I'd be really interested to touch and get some of your thoughts are on the sort of the levelling up agenda, which was very much sort of the conversations we're having pre-COVID. I think the Northern Powerhouse agenda was beginning to get some traction as well. Obviously, Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham are very much championing for more power to the regions, specifically around having seats on the Cobra table to be able to actually understand how we can regionally open up better, but also from a financial point of view and championing for more devolution. I just sort of wondered what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, the North is as important, if not more, than previously. Where will the country's economy, my boss is Irish, and I always refer to him and say, well, Manchester's economy is bigger than that of Ireland. Where is this growth going to come from? And there is no way the UK is going to stop growing. We have to see it through the cycle. And no doubt, gentlemen like Andy Burnham that you've mentioned has see it that way as well. It's the phase between now and maybe 2 years out. And I think it could possibly be quite painful in the next 2 years to really see the businesses through. That does not make an area like the North, because that is the powerhouse and the growth engine of the country. And that does not make that, as well as the Midlands, we don't want to get into that debate, but that growth engine of the country has to take place, and we have to fuel it. Us as a bank, and please, I don't want to use this platform to advertise the bank. Well, we're incredibly committed to the North. This has not changed. Strategically, from a bank perspective, that is where we want to support customers. And we will continue to do that. We will continue to invest. We might be investing a little bit differently to what we did invest previously, where we'll invest in people and technology to support our staff, to support customers, opposed to bricks and mortar. So if you see a lesser investment into bricks and mortar, that doesn't mean that the bank is not investing. The bank will just be investing in other means. But in terms of geography, across our specific sectors, the North remains one of our prime areas where we want to be playing.
Great, thank you. So a question which is quite related in some ways to some of the things you just talked about from Elle Stubbs. How will C19 impact how the business itself does business? E.g. more or new different channels, use of more tech? I mean, you did touch on this just previously as well, but perhaps we could go into that a bit more detail.
It's going to accelerate the use of technology. The use of technology, if we look at just retail and shopping and so forth, if we just talk about things like that, technology was always there. We used the Amazons of the world to be able to help us as consumers and retailers. But technology will go a lot wider than that, and that will go to technology to support more on the business. So one could, whether in the manufacturing and placing orders, invoices, management of actual accounts and so forth, staff working remotely, not having them on sites, on premises, all of that technology will have to be something we'll bring back into our businesses. We'll certainly see paper less used. I'm sure many of us sitting around here don't have any paper on our desk. We use iPads, we make notes. 3 months ago, 4 months ago, that wasn't the case. We were still printing things. That just is an early stage indication of how technology we'll be leveraging and using it. I think it's going to be an easier way to be able to work. We'll certainly see productivity going a lot higher. Well-being is a different issue. I think well-being is something we'll have to focus on to how do we balance this, because we can't just be machines that work all the time. We have to manage our productivity in terms of our well-being as well. So there's a balance between the two. But there is definitely technology helps us to be able to get a better life in terms of people spending time with their families and their friends. They'll be able to do that. And technology can help us to do that. So I think there's the social side, there's the consumer side, and there's the business. So they're across all facets of our lives. We will certainly see technology being a big supporter. We as a bank, for what it might be worth, are going to use technology. I have Zoom calls and Teams calls with many of our customers. It's wonderful. It's fantastic because you can ask the simple question, how's it going, and ask them about the specific plant and how the manufacturing going and all the construction that's happening and that wing that they were building and so forth. And you can really get into it, and they take the camera around on the site, and it's just fantastic. It never takes away that you still want that personal engagement, and that will still happen, but you can get to more customers quicker, and it'll be able to help us. So a lot behind technology. I can talk on it forever. I'm just awfully passionate about it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the Pro Manchester, I'd always wanted to take it more online with regards to the offer that we have. And obviously, we've always had the physical events activity, and we have a variety of different email communications, but we've never done this before. And this has forced our hands. So for us, it's a real positive to see actually now we can start communicating this way, and we can deliver a whole new value for the members of Pro Manchester. That doesn't mean that we have to be in a physical space. But in saying that, you know, we do very much miss that. So perhaps we can maybe talk a little bit about the store on Market Street then, and what are the plans with regards to sort of reopening? Are there any yet anytime soon? And when can we look to maybe start getting back together?
Well, I actually think Market Street's going to be a very interesting case, because and do watch the space, because if we have a look at workspaces, we still need workspaces somewhere, and these rework spaces that we have, and it was more by accident than by design, obviously. But why can't Market Street be exactly that for our customers? To come together and have their meetings because they don't have natural workspaces, and just use Market Street and say, you know, can we use some of your space? Use a boardroom or two for a day or half a day, get together, have a meeting, and move on and move to the next space. We're certainly going to be doing that. We're certainly not going to be lavishing offices. We're going to need workspaces when we do get together as teams, or we get together as customers. With our customers, how are we going to engage with each other? And we do need those workspaces. I think the exchange of ideas is a piece that can work very well, and rather passionate about that, because the one thing about digital that's in the back of my mind is how do you develop new relationships? Now, the younger generation all develop their relationships via using technology. But with a few gray hairs, I sort of lack that. So I think cementing and building relationships and getting on site and there is a little bit of advantage to it. And so one will have to balance the one with the other. And I think a workspace or rework space that we can use is that way. We certainly hooked into Market Street. We're not going anywhere. That space is for our customers. We certainly want to do that. And I think it should become more of a test zone. And we'd like try and get some, as we open up and things start to mature, maybe we can get some feedback. Is this what customers want more of? And I think it'll be useful. Our guys in marketing will certainly be having the ears to the ground and staying very close to that and seeing how we can use it more.
Yeah. No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this technology is fantastic for connecting people, not just locally with regards to the fact that they can't work together anymore, but certainly on a much broader national and international scale as well. But I think certainly from perhaps a mentoring perspective, nothing beats the one-on-one. And actually, certainly with regards to your service to customers, you know, especially trying to navigate through this incredibly difficult, I don't really want to use the word unprecedented because it's used far too much at the moment, but it is. You know, people want to sort of see people to sit down and to discuss some of those real challenges and those fears and anxieties. And I think the only way to do that in some ways is to have that human interaction.
Correct.
Yeah. So, you know, the sooner we can start getting people back together, the better.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of covered the majority of my questions, Gavin. And I did promise at the beginning that if I could afford you a few extra minutes, that I would do. So, you know, I'll be giving you sort of 7 or 8 minutes back, unless there is anything else that perhaps you want to cover that we've not talked about already.
Yeah, well, you know, I just want to talk to people in Manchester. I think, you know, we live in a fantastic, and from my accent, you can obviously hear I'm not British, although sometimes I try and convince myself I do sound English. But if I can just say we live in a fantastic country, and the robustness of this, and we're going to go through challenges. And I think this is where, if anything, this should be the glue to bring us closer together, refine our models, build it. Us as a bank, and really, you know, Sam, I do apologize for using this platform if I'm advertising the bank, and that's certainly not my intent. But if we can support in any way, whether it be in the smallest way or we can at an industry level, this is not about profits and revenue. This is about a long-term game. We want to see businesses succeed. Quite embarrassing when you're reading my CV, and the only one thought that went through my mind is why I've done this for so many years is I absolutely love to see businesses successful. I absolutely love to see businesses successful. It hurts me as much as I'm sure it does to an owner, but seeing a business fail, irrespective of the reason, I always ask myself, for what could I have done better? So let's ask a few of those questions, and to Pro Manchester and to you, Sam, and for putting this together. You know, if these help, we'll spend as much time, we'll give as much time as we can, whether it's at any level, to be able to support you. So thank you very much, and to everybody, thank you very much for your time today.
I mentioned that I'd spoken to Sean prior to this to do a little bit of research, and the one thing that he did say to me was that Gavin is a man who is very, very passionate about his job, and enjoys it and gets an incredible amount from it. So, you know, I think that's very clear. It's definitely come through in your chat with us today. So a huge thank you from us. Thank you, Gavin. I really do appreciate you sharing some of your thoughts and your insight. We will post this event, send a survey around to the members, and if anyone's got any more questions that they'd like to perhaps pose to Gavin, that, you know, maybe we can filter those through and offer that connection for you there as well. But a huge thank you from us, and also a huge thank you to Virgin Money, who support our SME club and support Pro Manchester in general as well. Their support is invaluable to us going forward. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today as well. It's been great to have some of your questions come through. It's been a really interesting session, and thank you for joining us. We do have another knowledge exchange event happening next week on the 19th of June. This one specifically will be focused around the retail sector, and it will be hosted by our event partners, Greylinks, who couldn't be here with us today, but they will be joining us, and they will be back again next week. So just a final wrap up, just to say thank you to you all. Thank you to Gavin, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.